7 to 9 p.m. Eastern. Tonight, it's all over but the shouting. Brett Kavanaugh is sworn in. We'll talk about the court's newest member, what could be a long shadow over our politics, and the potential immediate effect on the midterms. Mississippi Senate candidate Mike Espy joins me to talk about whether it will reshape his tight race with just 30 days to go. And later, my interview with Dr. Christine Blasey Ford's attorneys after their client was shoved into the spotlight. What's next for her? But first, the week begins with Brett Kavanaugh taking his seat on the Supreme Court. Last night, President Trump was triumphant in Kansas under the banner "Promises Made, Promises Kept." Republican leadership spent the weekend celebrating. John Cornyn posting this photo. Not beers for Brett, but rather bubbly for Brett. Still, Kavanaugh's path swerved from certainty he would be confirmed to near certainty that he could not be. And in the process, it exposed one of the nastiest, most bare-knuckled confirmations in recent history. It is anyone's guess how long it's going to take for those wounds to heal. The die was cast long before any of us knew it, when Dr. Christine Blasey Ford wrote an anonymous letter to Democratic lawmakers. Before long, she was pushed out into the public spotlight on Capitol Hill for the world to decide whether she was credible or not. To the surprise of many, the president held off on targeting her until this week.
I had one beer. Well, do you think it was? Nope, it was one beer. Oh, good. How did you get home? I don't remember. How'd you get there? I don't remember. Where is the place? I don't remember. How many years ago was it? I don't know. I don't know.
Democrats have been openly wondering whether this will turn into midterm momentum, but that is cold comfort after losing the swing seat on the Supreme Court. And it has some rethinking their calculus altogether. The Washington Post reports, quote, Democratic strategists tracking polls in Republican-leaning states where Democratic senators are running for re-election said they were surprised by the apparently galvanizing impact that Trump's offensive had on his base. Brian Fallon, who ran a group opposing Kavanaugh, said the support for the judge increased in these states after Trump changed his tactics. As a result, Fallon said he had begun to reevaluate one of the dominant analyses of the 2016 election, which held that Trump was elected despite evidence of his sexual misconduct against him, not because the resulting controversy motivated his voters to the polls. Fallon said, quote, I feel like there was a primal scream type reaction from the Republicans' overly white, overly male base. It leaves open the question of whether any lessons have been learned from the 2016 election, particularly for Democrats. Let me bring in my panel. Here on set in D.C. is Washington Post congressional correspondent Paul Kane, Washington Post White House reporter and MSNBC political analyst Ashley Parker, former special assistant to the president and former press secretary to the vice president, Mark Lotter, and in New York, MSNBC national political correspondent and the author of The Red and the Blue, Steve Kornacki. Thank you all for being here tonight. And Paul Kane, I actually want to start with you because you and I have been running around the halls. I'm not exactly sure how to characterize it, but we have spent a lot of time on marble floors in the Capitol over the past 20 days. From kind of a history-making 30,000-foot perspective, what do you think happened over the course of this week that's going to matter most in the long term? And is the damage that's been done to the institution of the Senate irreparable?
I think the biggest long-term shift is on the court itself. This is a seat that for 47 years beforehand had been held by Lewis Powell, who was himself a centrist swing vote, and then Bork got defeated, and that led to Kennedy replacing Powell, who then spent 31 years as a centrist vote, especially on social issues. Kavanaugh has the possibility of shifting the court to the right for years to come. In terms of the Senate, Lindsey Graham summed it up best. He told me and a few others, if this isn't bottom, God help us. I think we're going to find out.
Cheerful. Steve Kornacki, let me go to you on this question that we sort of were talking about at the end of that script there. This idea that, you know, for Democrats, they may have learned the opposite lesson. You know, we all sort of assumed that the president overcame the obstacles of having had all of these misconduct allegations. And Brian Fallon was essentially arguing, well, actually, perhaps those attacks motivated his base to get out there. Is that what you see across the map?
There's an interesting parallel, I think, between how the politics of the Kavanaugh nomination maybe turned around in a way that allowed Republicans to get this nomination through, and what we saw time and time again in the 2016 campaign, I think most notably with that Access Hollywood tape around this time in 2016, but with so many other Trump controversies where in the moment when the controversy itself would come to light, when the Access Hollywood tape came to light in 2016, when the allegation against Kavanaugh came to light this time, when Christine Blasey Ford initially gave that testimony in front of the committee. In those moments, politically, it looked like the nomination was finished. Politically, in 16, it looked like Donald Trump was finished. But what would then happen was, over the next couple of days, hours, days, weeks even, the Republican side, the right side of the divide in this country, would start to see the issue in different terms. And they would start to see it more in terms of who their enemies were, how their enemies were treating them, how their enemies were treating this story. This was the media, this was the Democrats, this was popular culture ganging up on, in this case, Brett Kavanaugh, looking, turning over every stone, trying to get every piece of information out there, even including the Michael Avenatti stuff, I think most notably. It ends up having this rallying effect where there's a rallying behind Trump in 16, a rallying behind Kavanaugh this time, I think we saw, that had a lot to do with who their enemies were. And just the idea of being a bulwark against those enemies. I just remember when the polling came out, we had an NBC poll, I think it was a Survey Monkey poll, I think, that was in the field as the Access Hollywood tape came out in 2016. And I just remember it was in for 4 days. And you watched Trump's numbers collapse in the first 2 days. The second day of that poll, he was losing to Hillary Clinton by like 16 points that day, second day after the tape broke. By the fourth day, it was back to baseline.
And that tape actually, Ashley Parker, 2 years ago tomorrow, it came out.
Wow.
What, right?
Yeah.
Right? You have been doing some reporting on kind of how the White House thought through all of this, because initially the reaction to the president mocking Dr. Ford was incredibly negative from the senators whose votes at the end of the day were the ones that mattered. Have they come to see what he did ultimately as something that contributed to getting Kavanaugh confirmed?
Oh, they almost instantaneously thought what he did was a net positive. To be clear, it wasn't a strategic decision. They didn't sort of order him up to go off script. This was described to me as a president, as he often does, having a visceral sense of the moment and seizing what he saw was an opportunity. They knew there would be blowback, including from that very crucial trio of senators. But it's worth mentioning, first of all, that trio, two of whom voted for him, one, of course, who did not, none of them allowed the president's mocking of Dr. Ford to impact their decision. They came out, they condemned it, they were unhappy about it, but it did not affect how they voted on Kavanaugh on the court. And what was interesting was the White House said that the president, in doing that, and again, the White House would say that the president did not mock her. Quite reasonable people can disagree, but they argue that basically the president changed the momentum. He brought it away from a conversation and scrutiny of Judge Kavanaugh's debauchery and youthful drinking. He pointed out gaps in her memory, and it also sort of gave a green light and permission for Republican senators on Capitol Hill, for these outside groups, for people to take a much more aggressive approach, and they absolutely believe that that was one of the key moments that helped shift the momentum.
Interesting. I want to talk about kind of the, Mark Lauder, with you, the broader impact here. Grover Norquist told the Washington Post, quote, "We have been winning little victories with regulation. This is the big win. We are cutting down the forest, not the trees." You agree?
I would agree. It's one of the long-standing goals of Republicans, conservatives, was to stop the judicial activism of a liberal court. And so having a right-center majority that will look at the laws the way they were written, and the Constitution the way it was written, is something that's been long sought after. And I mean, going all the way back through Reagan, they could not get it done. And so we have finally seen 30 plus 40 years of work on this as a success.
So there's been some speculation, Maggie Haberman actually tweeted this earlier today, about whether or not this potentially opens the door for Republicans to break with the president, and hear me out on this, because they've actually gotten done what they needed him to do. they passed tax cuts, and they cemented a conservative majority on the court. So the argument would go, they don't necessarily need him anymore. Do you think that's fair or totally off base?
I think it's off base, and with all due respect to Maggie, but I think Republicans are going to say we're not done yet. I mean, there are at least a couple of more seats that may be coming up in what I would say the next 6 years, just given the age of the various justices. There are also still a lot of regulations that need to be rolled back. There are still more things that they need to do to reorganize government, and the president wants to keep this economy going. So I think there'll be a lot of reason to keep with this progress, and I think it's also a very strong message for the midterms and heading into 2020.
All right, so speaking of what people might do in 2020 or if there are additional seats on the court. During an interview this morning, Mitch McConnell was pressed on whether Republicans will seek to appoint a Trump nominee to the Supreme Court if a vacancy should become available in 2020, which is, of course, a presidential election year. The question harkens back to 2016 when McConnell led Republicans in blocking President Obama's nomination of Merrick Garland, claiming the president should not be able to choose a justice during an election year.
The answer to your question is we'll see whether there's a vacancy in 2020.
But you're not ruling out the possibility, since you're the Republican majority leader and there's a Republican president, that you would go for and push the nomination of a Trump nominee in the election year.
What I'm telling you is the history is you have to go back to 1880 to find the last time a Senate controlled by a party different from the president filled a vacancy on the Supreme Court that was created in the middle of a presidential election year. That's been the history.
Meanwhile, President Trump seems to believe Republicans will have multiple opportunities to appoint other justices, possibly many more.
You're going to have other Supreme Court justices' places to be filled. It could be 3, it could even be 4, it could be a lot.
Paul Kane. So to parse McConnell's words, and I actually sort of had missed how carefully he was parsing this, but he's saying he's leaving the door open to...
Absolutely.
I mean, because he's saying the last time that this happened in 1880 was actually when there was a split between control of the Congress and control of the White House, which obviously we don't have or won't have in we don't think we'll have in 2020.
Yeah, he called it the Biden rule 2 years ago when this was happening with Merrick Garland being nominated. And Joe Biden's floor speech in 1992 said nothing about who was in the Senate majority and who was in the White House. Biden was saying that the final months before a presidential election, you should not have a Supreme Court clash. And McConnell said that over and over and over and over again. But that was when he expected Hillary Clinton to win. Now it's, oh gosh, well, we might have a president who's in a different, the party's this, that. He is adding on addendum to his rule as he sees fit and he thinks it'll help him.
What's your view of McConnell's level of devotion to the Senate versus his devotion to politics? I mean, Democrats have really turned him into the villain in this whole affair. How much of that do you think is justified?
There's both. He is a Senate institutionalist, but he wants to win more than anything else. His autobiography was called The Long Game for a reason. It is all about trying to set up long game victories. And when it comes to judicial confirmations, Supreme Court especially, and winning elections, he has now 2 cycles in a row, 2016 and 18, thinks that those 2 things are coming together for him. And he's going to do that. He's going to choose that over Senate comedy every time.
Steve Kornacki, how do you think this plays out over the course of the next 30 days before the elections? Is your sense that this may be something where Republicans sit back or satisfied and say, hey, we don't actually need to show up, or does this enthusiasm bump that we're seeing keep going?
It's interesting. I've never known gratitude to be a motivating and energizing force in politics, which it seems to be what Republicans are counting on right here. I mean, I think it's almost unquestionable when you look at the polling that's out there, when you start to look at some of the fundraising, the grassroots fundraising numbers that we've started to see in the last few days, that there's been what Republicans have been searching for really the entire Trump presidency is some kind of equalizing boost in energy on their side to match what they're seeing on the Democratic side. In the last 10 days, days, 2 weeks, they have finally found it. But yes, the election is a month away. I mean, if you just think back 1 month earlier, 1 month ago today, what were the big defining stories in politics? It was the aftermath of John McCain's funeral and Donald Trump's handling of that. It was Paul Manafort. It was Michael Cohen. It was the anonymous op-ed. So, you know, are we still going to be talking about this in a month?
It's a great question. All right, when we continue, we're going to have much more on exactly this, how the Kavanaugh vote shuffles the deck on the midterms. Steve Kornacki is going to fire up his big board. And as we go to break, a look back at the 3 weeks that exposed some of the deepest divisions in our country. Kasie DC back after this.
Chaos over Kavanaugh's confirmation.
Christine Ford tells the Washington Post that she is the author of that confidential letter
accusing Supreme Court nominee Brett Kavanaugh of sexual assault.
I think this woman, whoever she is mixed up.
Here's what the judge says. This is a completely false allegation.
Very hard for me to imagine that anything happened.
Republican Senator Jeff Flake told multiple outlets today that he's not comfortable moving forward with the vote until he hears more from Kavanaugh's accuser.
She should testify under oath, and she should do it on Capitol Hill. Senate Republicans have a message for Dr. Christine Blasey Ford. Testify Monday, or they'll move on with a vote.
The New Yorker has published a piece claiming new sexual misconduct allegations against him during his college days at Yale.
A third woman accusing Brett Kavanaugh of sexual misconduct.
Do you have 50 votes?
I believe he'll be confirmed, yes.
Dr. Ford has arrived here on Capitol Hill.
With what degree of certainty do you believe Brett Kavanaugh assaulted you?
100%.
Do you think the American people are going to believe Dr. Ford?
What happened to her, I don't know. Why don't you believe him? What is it about him you don't want to believe?
This whole 2-week effort has been a calculated and orchestrated political hit.
The most unethical sham since I've been in politics.
We drank beer, liked beer, still like beer.
I think it would be proper to delay the floor vote.
There is a sense among some Republican leaders that a delay of Kavanaugh's vote is essentially a death sentence.
How did you get home? I don't remember. How'd you get there? I don't remember. How many years ago was it? I don't know.
3 of the 4 key senators voting to end debate and proceed to a final vote.
I could not conclude that he is the right person for the court.
I will vote to confirm Judge Kavanaugh.
The nomination of Brett M. Kavanaugh of Maryland to be an Associate Justice of the Supreme Court of the United States is confirmed.
Senator, do you think that there's still a place in the Democratic Party for you after this?
He's just an extraordinary person, a great talent, and I think he's going to make us all very proud.
One of the sharpest displays of divisiveness was the show of activism the Kavanaugh vote conjured, particularly among those on the left. Large crowds of Americans opposing Kavanaugh's appointment took to the steps of the Supreme Court and came inside the chamber in the Senate, with scores of them getting arrested. Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell called the opposition a, quote, great political gift for Republicans ahead of next month's midterm elections, adding that the opposition is charging up the Republican base.
Well, the people that were attacking our members at their homes and in the halls, it was really quite a display of aggressiveness, far beyond what I would consider peaceful protesting. They were trying to intimidate members of the Senate, not only in our home states, but also up here, actually in the Capitol and at our homes here in Washington. And I'm really proud of my members for not knuckling under to those kind of mob-like tactics.
The president is hitting the trail this week for a string of rallies for fellow Republicans. He's going to stump for Congressman David Young in Council Bluffs, Iowa. The next day, he heads to Erie, PA, before going to Ohio. And on Saturday, the president finishes his trip in Kentucky. For more, let's bring back NBC News national political correspondent Steve Kornacki, who is now at the big board. Steve, how does this all shake out?
Yeah, I mean, you're talking about that sort of bounce in energy Republicans have seen. Just to show you what those numbers look like over the summer, A Marist PBS NPR poll over the summer, there was a 10-point advantage in enthusiasm for Democrats. You can see it right there. Their new poll just a couple days ago. Look where it is now, that 10-point gap down to 2 points. That's the surge in Republican enthusiasm the Kavanaugh nomination fight seems to have produced. Look, though, what this is doing potentially in the Senate battleground states. Remember, disproportionately, the Senate battleground tends to be in Trump states, Trump-friendly states. For example, North Dakota. Trump won it by 36 points in 2016, and now Heidi Heitkamp, Democratic incumbent, this from a few days ago, down 12 points. Of course, Heitkamp voting against this nomination. Is that going to, in North Dakota, complicate her re-election further? Remember, Heitkamp, clearly the most vulnerable Democrat. Flip side of that, West Virginia. Trump won the state by 42 points. Manchin, this from a few days ago, but Manchin's been running pretty strongly in his re-election. The only Democrat to vote for this nomination. Is that going to solidify his hold on that Trump state? Then take a look at Tennessee. This is where it seems we may be seeing some significant movement. A new poll out this morning showing Marsha Blackburn, the Republican, leading Phil Bredesen, former governor, by 8 points. There was a poll a couple days ago that put Blackburn ahead by 5. That is a change from what we've been seeing. A lot of other polls have shown Bredesen, very popular within the state personally, have shown him leading. Keep an eye on that. Texas, Ted Cruz up 6. Again, we continue to see Cruz leading this race, not overwhelming, but leading. And then Nevada, this is the one sort of exception to the rule. In Dean Heller, you have the only Republican incumbent who's running for re-election in a state that Trump lost in 2016. Nevada went for Hillary Clinton by a couple points. Here's Heller trailing Rosen, and of course Heller voted for this nomination. So is that going to complicate his politics? And very quickly, if you put those battleground states, we think this is sort of the Senate battleground. The good news for Democrats, hey, say West Virginia, say Manchin hangs on there. Take a look at Nevada. Let's say Jackie Rosen were to win there. Take a look at Arizona. The polling's been strong for them there. There's a couple of bright spots for them. But if you see in these new polls, look, if Cruz hangs on in Texas, if Heitkamp can't pull off a big comeback in North Dakota, and if Tennessee now starts to shift away from the Democrats, that's all Republicans would need. That would be 50 with Mike Pence breaking any tie. That would preserve the Republican majority in the Senate, even if Democrats swept those remaining states. So that's why we've always said uphill climb for Democrats. That news out of Tennessee and North Dakota, particularly concerning for them, Kasie.
Steve, thanks. Paul Kane, what's your take on what he just walked through there? I mean, where are Republicans' heads on
First of all, I just love how he works the board.
It's amazing. We love him.
What you're seeing is two divergent maps. There is a map in the House of Representatives where all the key races are in suburban battlegrounds where white suburban women are breaking against the president and really were energized by her testimony, Christine Blasey Ford's testimony. But in the Senate, these are rural states, they're older states and they're whiter states where Democrats are trying to defend. And you could have, for the first time in something like 45 years, an election in which one party wins more House seats and the other party wins more Senate seats. It usually never works that way. The momentum always goes in one direction, but this year, right now, it's going in the opposite direction.
Ashley, what's the White House's thinking about how to best deploy the president, especially after Kavanaugh?
So first of all, the White House was incredibly happy at these tough votes that red state Democrats had to take. I guess Senator Manchin is perhaps the one exception, but they sort of say it only helps the map. I think what you're seeing is, first of all, the president, you went through the schedule, he's mixed. I was going to say he loves to travel, but that's not quite true. He loves the comforts of home, but he loves being out on the campaign trail at these huge rallies, feeding off of the energy, getting the feedback from the crowd, knowing which way to move. So I think you're going to see that ramping up until the election. You're going to see 4, 5, 6 Make America Great rallies every single week. He's going to be going into these Senate states where he's a huge draw. The part that's a little trickier is getting him into these Senate states, but as Paul was saying, keeping him away from some of these House seats where suburban women may not love him standing there mocking a victim of sexual assault.
Yeah. So I want to talk for a second, particularly about North Dakota, because the road is going to get especially precarious for Heidi Heitkamp, as Steve pointed out. She is out with this new ad trying to explain her vote. Take a look.
I'm Heidi Heitkamp, our country apart. I approve this message because I believe a senator has to put politics aside and do what's right for our country.
So, Paul, she's still fighting. Is this a strategy that can work?
She's trying to be authentic, if nothing else. It's just her, straight to camera, no bells, no whistles, no big letters, explosions. It's just her trying to explain. It's tough, though. It's tough. She's in a state that went to Trump by 36 points, I think, and she's in a hole right now. She really needs the conversation to just go back to pre-existing conditions and health care and anything but this vote. Anything but. All right. Just ahead, my conversation with the attorneys for Dr. Christine Blasey Ford. I talked to them about whether their client would still come forward given everything that's happened. Kasie, DC, back after this. While we know what is next for Justice Kavanaugh, what's next for Dr. Christine Blasey Ford remains to be seen. Earlier this week, I spoke with her attorneys, Deborah Katz and Lisa Banks.
I just want to start by asking, how is Dr. Ford doing after all of this?
I think she's doing pretty well, all considered. She feels good about the fact that she came forward and was able to share her experience with the committee and give them more information in order to make their decision.
Does she have any regrets about coming forward? Her life has changed forever.
I really don't think she has regrets. I think this has been an extremely difficult process for her, but she felt strongly that she needed to bring this information to the committee, and she did that. And then she took the courageous step of testifying in front of the American people. And I don't think she has any regrets because she still believes it was the right thing to do and that it was important.
I will say this has been terrifying. Her family has been through a lot. They are not living at home. It's going to be quite some time before they're able to live at home. The threats have been unending. It's deplorable. It's been very frightening. And she's also received extraordinary letters of support and encouragement. But these threats are extremely distressing.
Did she watch Judge Kavanaugh's testimony?
She did not.
Has she seen any of it in the wake of it?
Of course.
And so she is still convinced that this is absolutely what happened to her and that it was this man who did it?
She's not convinced. She knows it. As she testified, she knew him, he knew her, and she knows exactly who sexually assaulted her on that day.
She has never wavered and never questioned her testimony on that point.
Republicans have put the two of you in the spotlight, calling you Democratic operatives in some cases. Did you ever coordinate with Democrats on the committee through this process?
We did not.
No.
There was no communication whatsoever?
Well, there was communication in the sense that when she hired us, she had already been in touch with Senator Feinstein, and we were in touch with the committee to say she wants you to honor her request for confidentiality. We were in touch with that office. But there was no coordination. There was no effort to leak this letter and have this unfold as it did. That's an absolute falsehood that the Republicans are perpetuating. It is untrue.
What would the witnesses that you wanted to speak to the FBI have been able to say that senators have not been able to hear?
We keep hearing that there are no corroborating witnesses, but in fact there are corroborating witnesses who haven't been interviewed or talked to. And those witnesses can say, several years ago, well before Judge Kavanaugh was ever considered for the Supreme Court, she told me that he sexually assaulted her. And this is years ago. Those people were not interviewed by the FBI. Those people were not called before the committee. So those are the kinds of witnesses, that's the kind of evidence that isn't before the senators.
And have you seen any of the results of the investigation yourselves?
No, but we know what's not in the investigation, and that's what's crucial.
I'm wondering what Dr. Blasey Ford views as her place in history in the wake of all of this.
I don't know that she herself is thinking about it in those terms. I think she's looking to get back to her life. But I think what others looking at this can see is that her efforts, her courageous actions, have spoken to hundreds of thousands of women across this country, women and men, people who have found their voice and are able to speak up as victims of sexual assault.
Did Dr. Blasey Ford see President Trump mocking her on the campaign trail?
Yes.
What was her reaction?
I think she was as horrified as the rest of us were. It's terrible. It's disrespectful. It's horrible.
Was she emotional about it? Was it distressing?
She was upset by it, yes. As any woman would be who's the victim of sexual assault, who is mocked and belittled by anyone, never mind the President of the United States.
As this whole saga is coming to a close, what does Dr. Blasey Ford hope that the country takes away from what she did?
That people have a civic duty to come forward. That even if you're terrified, people should be courageous.
What do you both think is different about how this process has played out with Dr. Blasey Ford compared to what happened in 1991 with Anita Hill?
Well, with Anita Hill, there was a full FBI investigation before there was ever a hearing. That did not occur here. This process was far worse.
We thought it was bad back in 1991, and it's even worse today. The political climate and how women are treated.
Thanks to the attorneys for sitting down with me this week. Mark Lauder, I gotta say, I'm not convinced that Republicans haven't done irreparable damage to their party with women voters.
I think they showed Dr. Ford a lot of courtesy when they brought her in. They worked diligently to bring her in on her terms, made a lot of different offers to bring her in and let her testify. At the end of the day, her story could still not be backed up. The witnesses that she named that were supposedly at this alleged party where this incident took place, none of them could actually testify that that happened or they knew about it. So I hope that America and everyone will allow Dr. Ford to return to the life that she wants to have in the future. We heard her story, and the Senate voted. They voted on what they thought, that there was zero corroborating evidence for these accusations. And I hope that what we do is that we also allow the fact that Justice Kavanaugh now is also has to live with this, and he's going to have to move on, and how he conducts himself, as Clarence Thomas has done for the last, since the allegations were made against him in the early 90s. He's now considered by many to be, a highly respected jurist and legal scholar, and I hope that Justice Kavanaugh will be given the same opportunity.
Okay, we should point out the president did mock Dr. Blasey Ford, although your point is taken that the Senate tried to treat her with courtesy. All right, when we continue on KCDC, we'll talk about a process in dire need of repair. And don't miss our KCDC podcast. If you missed the show, you can still hear the highlights from the broadcast, our biggest interviews, breaking news, and
these are people, I'm not going to name names, but I'm not sure they have a soul. I don't think their mother breastfed them. I think they went right to raw meat. They think he's a smoked turkey. It's time for the senators to be senators, for women to women up, men to man up. If you think this is a search for the truth, you probably ought to put down the bomb.
That was the always quotable Senator John Kennedy venting some of his frustrations this week. Meanwhile, some senators have sought to restore the brand of the U.S. Senate, decrying tribalism and accusing both sides of exploiting a sensitive moment for political gain. Senators Jeff Flake and Ben Sasse sought to relieve some of the cynicism that has infected their hallowed halls.
We all know that the president cannot lead us through this time. We know that he's dispositionally unable to restrain his impulse to divide us. His mockery of Dr. Ford last night in Mississippi was wrong, but it doesn't really surprise anyone. It's who he is. Similarly, it was wrong last week when he said that, quote, if the attack on Dr. Ford was as bad as she says, charges would have been immediately filed with local law enforcement authorities, unquote. It was wrong when people insinuate that a woman bears blame for her sexual assault because she was drunk. This reinforces the stereotypes that have caused millions of women to bury their experiences of abuse and assault for decades. This kind of repugnant nonsense creates excuses for abusers. Just because a woman drinks, or even if she drinks too much, does not make her body or her sexuality any less her own. And I don't want anyone telling those poisonous lies to my daughters. I also have a son, and in the event that, God forbid, he's ever accused of a crime, I hope he's presumed innocent and that he's permitted to exercise his right to defend himself.
So that was Ben Sasse, who's actually one of the younger members of the Republican conference in the Senate. And Ashley, one of the things I picked up on as I was covering this week is there was a difference. They all voted the same way at the end of the day. But there was, to a certain extent, I had a couple private conversations that revealed a level of discomfort among the younger generation of Republican senators, Ben Sasse, Jeff Flake, Tim Scott, perhaps even Marco Rubio, that they felt more uncomfortable with this debate than some of the older members, the old bulls, if you will.
I think that's probably right. I think the thing you said about they all voted the same way is probably still the most important thing right now. But it is interesting when we sort of look at those hallway quotes. You have, you know, Senator Grassley saying that the reason that there's no Republican women on the committee is because women don't like to work hard. So sort of the more problematic quotes that are going to send moderates, women, suburbanites fleeing from the Republican Party, you are right. You're not hearing them from that younger generation of people. But the Senator Hatches, the Senator Grassleys, there certainly is a difference in rhetoric. What will be interesting to see is how much do voters care about the rhetoric and how much do they care about the actual vote at the end of the day.
Yeah, Paul, what's your take on this? I'm sort of interested to see in the long term how this debate has affected the party, and I wonder if that's not an early indicator.
I think you're right. There is a generational difference, but is there a place for those people in the Senate Republican Conference? Jeff Flake is already retiring. He'll be gone next year. Ben Sasse told me, and he's told many others, he's not sure if he's going to run for re-election in 2020. He doesn't ever really seem happy in the Senate. So they have to figure that part out of how to recruit newer, younger people, diverse people, and actually how to retain them and get them reelected.
Mark Lauder, to button this up, is there any constituency in the Republican Party anymore for civility? Because it seems like they all want Donald Trump's brand of in-your-face politics.
Well, I mean, I would say the same place on the Democrat side where you have video.
No, but I want to focus on the Republicans here.
I think
these people do not seem to Paul's point, have a constituency in the party anymore.
Well, I think there's a lot of civility that we see, and we have to remember. And I think Senator McConnell said this while all of this debate was going on and all of the media attention, rightfully so, was on this confirmation. They, in a large bipartisan fashion, passed one of the largest opioid protection bills around. The Senate is still working, and you know as well as I do, Kasie and Paul, you guys cover this, and Ashley, you all cover this a lot. 90% of what the Senate and the House does is very procedural, very formatic, and it's very much usually...
Yeah, no, spending money is easy.
Right, it's usually very large majorities on, but it's the handful of things that go along partisan lines where that get all the attention, and rightfully so. So I think civility is still there. I think we do have members who have generational challenges, as probably many of us do in our own families when we have some of our older relatives who say things like, not really supposed to say it that way anymore. We all have those issues.
Senate, you know? But he's not a U.S. senator.
But I also worry on the other side, especially as we're talking about how it impacts women. When you look at the video of people clawing at the brass doors of the Supreme Court, screaming expletives inches away from police officers' faces, and shrieking and being led out of the Senate or storming the Capitol, that is not necessarily a protest that's going to attract moderate, mainstream women.
That is what McConnell is arguing is going to help
to the protest party.
Yeah, all right. Mark Lauder, Ashley Parker, Paul Kane, thank you all for a great discussion tonight. Really appreciate it. In our next hour, we're going to have a first look at her interview with Donald Trump Jr. on the campaign trail. But first, a perfect book for this moment. We're going to take a closer look at America's deep divide. How and when did we become red or blue? We're going to talk about Steve Kornacki's brand new book up next.
Yes, we're still here, and it's still too close to call.
Just before 8 p.m. in the East, a projection that portends trouble for the Texas governor. Al Gore appears to have won Florida.
NBC News projects that he wins the 25 electoral votes in the state of Florida.
The news comes during a Bush family dinner. Startled, they quickly return to the governor's mansion. The nominee works the phones, criticizing the network's projection as premature.
A state like Florida, for example, I'm going to wait till they count all the votes. And I think America ought to wait before they count all the votes, too.
That was the NBC Nightly News digesting election night in 2000, nearly 24 hours after the polls had closed in Florida. In his new book, The Red and the Blue, Steve Kornacki writes, quote, "Red America and Blue America, as we now know them, were born on November 7th, 2000, the product of an entire nation torn perfectly in half. But these divisions were created in the decade that preceded them." And Steve is back with us to talk more about this book, which is prescient. And Steve, first of all, thank you for sending me an early copy with those handwritten notes with the photos inside. That was really lovely of you.
I didn't have photos in the advanced copy, so I put photocopies in.
I really appreciate it. One of the things that was interesting to me is actually right at the outset of the book, and I hadn't really thought through it in these terms. I'm a child of the 90s. Everything was great.
Right.
You point out that the economy was humming right along. You know, we were not at war. It was a peaceful time. And yet our politics took a turn for the worst. What do you, in the 3 minutes that we have, what are the most important things that people should look for in this book that apply to what we're seeing today?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think it's everything that we talk about and in some ways take for granted in our politics when we say it's broken now. Take a look at the Supreme Court, nomination politics. You look at the battle over, the filibuster, how the filibuster 5 years ago was thrown out on most of these judicial nominations, then the Republicans threw it out on the Supreme Court. All of these sort of norms, all of these traditions, all of these customs in politics that used to sort of breed some level of bipartisan cooperation, just one by one they're being discarded, they're being tossed aside for the purposes of political, partisan political warfare. And I think you really do have to look back to the 1990s to see the creation of that, because I think the key thing that happened in the 1990s, and it's expressed in that perfect tie election of 2000, but what was happening politically in the 90s was that all of the major divisions in this country, cultural divisions, geographic divisions, demographic divisions, they started to sync up with political party. And that's what red and blue mean to me. The terms red and blue America, it feels like we've had them forever. It was election 2000. It was that night when people started to look at that map and saw those divides in that form, that red and blue, that those terms were kind of created. If you had said the term red America 5 years earlier, nobody would have known what you're talking about. But it was the political wars of the 90s. It was Newt Gingrich leading the Republicans against Bill Clinton.
Yeah, can I ask you about Clinton actually quickly? Because, that was one thing that, I was reminded of. I mean, Brett Kavanaugh, now Justice Kavanaugh, he was an operative. He worked for Ken Starr, and he raised the Clintons in this hearing, which a lot of people felt was stunning. But the fissures of that war, I mean, we're still fighting that same war.
No, absolutely. And I mean, it was 20 years ago. I believe it was this day, in fact, 20 years ago, or it might have been tomorrow. I can't remember exactly what day it was, that House Republicans voted to launch the impeachment inquiry against Bill Clinton. And you had a couple months later the impeachment of Bill Clinton. And we think of the impeachment as the big political drama of the 1990s, but remember, the investigation that led to that moment, actually the Ken Starr investigation, that began in the summer of 1994. The Whitewater controversy sort of sprung up as soon as Bill Clinton became president. It was a series of wars, a series of momentous events, the Republican Revolution, the government shutdown, Clinton's comeback, impeachment, and I just think they were all building to that moment that you could really see the country was torn in half. We've been living with that world since, and it's the world that, about 2 decades later, Donald Trump came along, and whatever side you're on, whatever you think of Trump, he saw in those divisions opportunity, and it's a big reason, I think, why he's president today.
He did indeed, and honestly, I've been telling anyone who can listen who's been surprised by Lindsey Graham the last couple of weeks that they have forgotten what Lindsey Graham was like during impeachment. Steve Kornacki, thank you. The book is The Red and the 90s and the Birth of Political Tribalism. Go out, buy a copy, read it. Steve, thank you so much. In our next hour, just in, Taylor Swift makes a political endorsement. Plus, the Kasie DVR. Our team of producers watches the Sunday shows so you don't have to. We're back after this.